So here's a look at all 21 shades in the palette. The top row has deeper, more smoky shades, while the middle row has bright pops of color, and then the last row is more pastel shades. In the first row, we have the shades Alchemy, Warning, Midnight Blaze, followed by 100, Minx, Delirious, and Platonic. Then in the second row, we have the shade Gossip, Seize, Calavera, Hatter, Blindsided, Sketch, and Iced. Then in the last row, we have the shade Paranoia, Jones, Goldmine, Mean, Metamorphosis, Faded, and Bump. So as usual for my swatches, I will be applying them over a very light layer of eyeshadow primer, and I'm using my Urban Decay Eyeshadow Primer Potion. This is just the original version, and I'll be using my Kat Von D Shade and Light Eyeshadow Brush for this. I will be using the stiffer side of the brush. And to clean my brush after each swatch, I simply swipe it against a dry, clean hand towel. So we'll do the swatches by column since they are color themed. So we're starting out with the pinks. And the first shade up is Alchemy, which is described as a deep fuchsia satin. This to me is more of a muted cranberry plum shade. It has decent color payoff and it does have more of a satin finish to it. Then we have the shade Gossip, which is described as a bright metallic pink with subtle floating pearl. This is actually not a very bright pink shade and it's not very metallic either. It's more of a satin finish muted cherry pink shade, and it has a little bit of silver sheen to it. It applies a little bit sheer and it does want to kick up a lot of powder, so you do have to be careful with that one. Then we have the shade Paranoia, which is described as a soft metallic blue pink. Paranoia is definitely a very light and sheer shade. I don't really read metallic from this either. It seems like a very light lavender tinted pink shade with a little bit of microfine silver and gold sparkle to it. Now moving on to the orangey tones, we have the shade Warning, which is described as a deep metallic copper. Warning is a coppery orange shade. It's actually pretty beautiful. It's not high shine frost either. It's more of a subtle satin sheen. Then we have the shade Seize, which is described as a bright metallic coral with subtle floating pearl. Seize is a sheer blood orange tone. It actually is a little bit dry and stiff in the pan, and it does come off very powdery and loose, so it's dusting off as you're swatching it. That one will be a troublesome shade to work with. Then we have the shade Jones, which is described as a metallic orange with subtle floating pearl. Jones is a bright golden orange shade. It's really beautiful and it has subtle microfine gold glitter in it as well, but it is a sheer shade. You will have to build that one up, but it's a beautiful color. Moving on to the more yellow and golden shades. The first shade up is Midnight Blaze, which is described as a black matte with yellow gold pearl. Midnight Blaze is a troublesome shade. It actually is very difficult to get on your brush. As you rub your brush across this shade, it kind of creates a hard top layer and the color doesn't pick up on your brush at all. So you have to scratch at the surface to get color up. And even then, it's a very sheer shade. It's more of a smoky khaki shade with yellow gold glitter to it. Not a very good shade at all. This is very unimpressive. If you really want this shade to work, you're gonna have to put in some elbow grease and really scratch at it and use a very, very sticky primer or a colored base. Then keeping with the yellows, we have Calavera, which is described as a bright yellow matte with subtle floating pearl. Calavera is a bright sunshine yellow and it does have that microfine gold glitter to it. It's a very sheer color. Yellows are a little bit difficult to do, but it does come off as a bright, bold, intense color. You'd have to use a sticky base or like a white base to really make this pop on your skin, but just picking up on my skin by itself, it doesn't really show up that well, but it's still a nice intense shade. Then we have the shade Goldmine, which is described as a metallic yellow gold. Goldmine was actually doing the same thing that Midnight Blaze was doing. It creates this hard glaze over the top when you swipe your brush across it. And as you can see, it's coming off very sheer and even a little bit chunky, like it has more of a flaky texture to it. Another disappointing shade. That one is not really coming off with full pigmentation and it is patchy in areas. That again is another shade that you would need to do a lot of work with. Let's move on to the greens. We have the shade 100, which is described as a deep metallic forest green. 100 is a blackened forest green shade, and it actually has decent pigmentation and applies pretty nicely. This would make a great deep green smoky look. Then we have the shade Hatter, which is described as a vibrant green with tonal micro sparkle. This one was in the Alice Through the Looking Glass palette. Hatter is a very bright grass green and it has micro sparkle to it, but it barely shows up. It really comes off as a complete matte, but it does have subtle micro fine teal glitter to it, which makes it not a flat matte. It's more of a satin finish. It's a beautiful shade with great pigmentation and it actually builds up really great as well. And then last up for the greens, we have the shade Mean, which is described as a bright metallic lime green. Mean is a little bit more sheer in pigmentation. You do have to build this color up and really pick up color for it to show up. Again, another sheer shade. It's not really highly pigmented at all. It's not giving me great intensity. So here are the first 12 shades swatched. Again, I swatched them by column and color theme. The first up are the pinks, which are not very impressive. The lightest shade is a sheer shade. Then we have the oranges, again, not very impressive shades. The first shade is a nice shade with good pigmentation, but the other two are more sheer, more powdery, more loose. And then moving on to the golds and yellows, these are another set of failure shades. All three are sheer colors, and that dark shade and that light shimmery shade. They're very chunky, they form hard pan in the palette. They just don't pick up well on the brush, and then they have textural issues where they just get patchy and chunky and it's just a mess. And then the greens are actually the most impressive in the palette. The two first shades are beautiful, have great pigmentation. The last one you do have to build up. It's more of a sheer finish, but those two shades are actually the best in the first 12 shades that I've swatched. Now moving on with the rest of the shades, we're starting out with the blues. The first one up is Minx, which is described as a deep navy matte with floating tonal pearl. Minx is a rich, deep navy shade with a little bit of multi-dimensional sparkle to it, but it still comes off as mostly matte. That shimmer shows up, but not as intensely as you would think. And thankfully, it isn't chunky shimmer or glitter, but that shade's gonna apply more like a complete matte, and it has great pigmentation. I am very impressed with that one. Next up, we have the shade Blindsided, which is described as a bright teal blue matte with floating pearl. Blindsided is what I would call a bright ocean blue. It has a hint of like a teal, a little touch of green to it, but it's a bold, intense blue. It actually applies really smoothly. It's not patchy, it's not dry, and it also does have that micro shimmer to it. But again, it applies mostly matte. You don't really see the shimmer show up. And then we have Metamorphosis, which is described as a vibrant periwinkle blue with micro sparkle. Metamorphosis is exactly as described. It's a light periwinkle blue shade, a little bit more sheer. Again, not much pigmentation to this one, and it does come off a little bit patchy in areas. You can see my skin through certain areas, and in other areas it's a little bit more pigmented. Moving on to the purples, we have the shade Delirious, which is described as a deep plum matte with subtle floating pearl. Delirious is kind of a dirty matte purple shade. Again, a little bit patchy, doesn't really apply opaquely in one swipe. You can definitely build the shade up to better opacity, and you would probably use this in the outer of your outer crease so you won't see that patchiness show through, but just be mindful that can be a troublesome shade as well. Then we have the shade Sketch, which is described as a metallic medium purple. Sketch is a more sheer, dirty purple shade. Again, it's not really metallic. It has more of a satin finish. It does build up pretty decently, but it's more of a light finish. I wouldn't say it's sheer, but it's a lighter pigmentation. It's not really fully opaque. And then we have the shade Faded, which is described as a lavender with gold shimmer. Faded definitely has more bold shimmer to it, so I expect there to be a lot of fallout with that glitter. And it's more of a sheer matte lavender shade. It's more like a dirty lavender actually, and it builds up, but again, it's a little bit looser, a little bit more powdery, so you're gonna have fallout issues with this one for sure. Moving on to the final column, we have the silvers and white. The first shade up is Platonic, which is described as a black matte with iridescent glitter. Platonic is a smoky, sooty matte black shade, and it does have that tonal micro glitter to it. The glitter doesn't really show up, so if you want it to show up, you're definitely going to need to use a sticky base. And it's not a rich pigmented black either. It's more of a sooty charcoal black. It does build up pretty decently. You can probably use this to deepen up the crease or use it as an all over smoky eye. Then we have the shade Iced, which is described as an oyster silver with shimmer. Iced is a sheer chunky silver glitter shade with a little bit of a taupey undertone, like a gray taupe undertone. It's very sheer, not a smooth finish at all. You can definitely use this as a glitter shade because it's not gonna give you full opacity at all unless you probably use it damp. And then last up we have the shade Bump, which is just a matte white shade. Bump is, like it says, a matte white, and surprisingly it applies pretty nicely. It's not the most intense white shade, but it does have pretty decent payoff considering the other shades. So here are all 21 shades swatched, and again, there are more failure shades in this palette than impressive shades. A couple of these shades are really beautiful, a couple of the blues, a couple of the greens, that one purple, but overall, most of these shades fall short. They're choppy, they're chalky, they're loose, they're just not good quality shadows at all.